Hi there. Just take a moment to think about a favourite book or a favourite novel that sticks out in your mind. We all have them. Now, what do you remember about this book? Is it the description, the way the story was told, or the narrative, or something else? For most of us, what we remember about a novel is the character, the main character. We identify with him or her, we want them to succeed, they have struggles, and we want to read the book to find out what happens to them. Elements of a novel include narrative, description, and characters, and several other minor elements. But most people agree that the characters are absolutely key to the story and the novel. If the reader doesn't care what happens to the characters, then they will simply not carry on. They won't turn the pages, and your story will not be read. Now, obviously, it's the integration of all these elements of a story, of a novel, that create the overall impression and create a great book. But without a doubt, character creation and the way that we develop those characters is absolutely key to a good story. When I began to write my first novel, I really could have done with a cheat sheet, some guidelines, some simple guidelines to give me some ideas of how to continue and how to develop characters and narrative and dialogue. And that's why I created this series of courses, to give you, a new writer, some guidelines and simple rules that you can apply quickly to help you write your novel. In this course, you learn how to create characters and how to make them real and believable for your readers. Sign up now, and I'll see you inside. Before we start to create our characters and develop them to make them real, let's familiarize ourselves with the various elements of a modern novel. The theme of the novel is the underlying meaning. What is the author trying to say? This is sometimes simple and it's sometimes complex. The plot can be in several sections, but often has one main plot. It's a roadmap from the beginning to the end. It's a way that the author draws the reader through the story along with the main character. The setting, or the settings, is where the novel and the action take place. Narration is the act of telling the story, and the narrator can either use the first person or the third person. That is to say, he can start telling the story from the point of view of I or me, or he can say he or she. There are other points of view possible, but these two are the main ones, and for a beginning writer, the most preferred. The study of creating and developing characters also includes the study of dialogue, the way that the characters speak to each other, drive the story forward, and display emotion and conflict. Characters drive the story forward through their action and their dialogue. Dialogue with other people involving conflict, and also internal dialogue. They need to involve the reader's emotions so that the reader cares what happens to them. So where do these characters come from? They come from inside the author, from the author's experiences and observations about everyday life. Here are some important characteristics of great characters. They must be realistic, so we believe them. They must be complex. Everyone is a mixture of emotions, desires, and motivations. The character should have a rounded personality. It shouldn't be too much this or too much of that, and not too extreme in any one way, without a balancing emotion or action of the other sense. A character needs to have a history, like an ordinary person. This history needn't be told outright, but can be hinted at and developed throughout the novel. It helps if the reader can easily identify with the character's frustrations and his dreams and desires. The reader likes to sympathize with a character. He wants to be on the character's side, to feel sorry for the character, in short, to become emotionally involved. Basically, the reader needs to care for the character. All of the above indicates that the reader must perceive the character as being real. The author's job is to craft the character in such a way that the reader can suspend belief and start to follow the character's story. So how does an author create a character? The process starts with getting to know them yourself. Where do they live? What do they eat, for example? Where do they eat? What makes them angry? These and many other questions help to round out the character. It's a great tool for an author to create a profile for each character and to fill in the blanks. And this is what we'll take a look at in the next video. Characters, like all living things, are born. We need to make the reader see them as real people that have a history, likes and dislikes, and many other facets to their personalities that normal people have. The ideas for such characters come from everyday life, from our friends, from people we meet, even someone we see and think they may have an interesting story or an interesting way of being. The question is, how does an author take a character idea and turn it into a rounded personality, a believable, real personality that the readers can believe in? The secret to making a character that your reader can believe in is to first of all believe in them yourselves, asking questions along the way. What makes this character tick? Where does he live? Did he have a happy childhood? Is he rather an angry person or a calm person? All these kind of things that you find in ordinary people, in your friends, family and relations. The object of character analysis and creating a written profile is so that you, the author, get to know the character and believe in the character yourself. If a character acts in a certain way that doesn't make sense because of his background or personality, then the reader will find a problem with believing everything that's happening in your story. Let's take a closer look at how we create a profile by analyzing our characters. Different characters can have different depth. What do I mean by depth? Depth can be described as two-dimensional or three-dimensional. A hero would be three-dimensional, a rounded character with depth, with a history, and a waiter or a taxi driver, for example, could be called two-dimensional. A two-dimensional character will generally appear briefly in your story. They will just come and go. Nothing needs to be said about them really, maybe a little description, but they really don't need to be explained. They're simply there so that the story can continue. On the other hand, three-dimensional characters are more complete. They have rounded personalities. They have a history. You can believe and see how they were in the past, and you understand the events that made them the kind of person that they are. These people are realistic and believable. They have complex emotions and motivations that can change throughout the story. In fact, it's very necessary that the character does change. his internal landscape should undergo growth and new awareness. His internal landscape changes throughout the story because of the challenges and the obstacles that are placed before him so that he can't achieve his desires. This is called a character arc, and we'll talk more about this later on in the course. To create a three-dimensional character, the author must know as much as possible about the character that they have created. You need to know about their background. Where do they live? Were they poor? Were they rich? Did they love their mothers? Did they prefer their fathers? What kind of flaws did they have? No one is perfect, and a three-dimensional character, even in a novel, should not be perfect. What are their dreams and hopes for the future? What are their greatest regrets about the past? Describe their loves and their fears. The details of such characters should be delivered slowly to the reader and sparingly, not all at once. Instead of showing everything about a character at one time, let the character develop throughout the novel. In this way, he or she can change and grow with time. Please note that not all the details from the character analysis will be used in the novel. You're simply creating as much detail as possible so that you, the author, can get to know your character, so that you can persuade the reader that your character is real. Normally, this means internal growth. The character will change as he overcomes conflict and obstacles either from events or other characters in the novel. Here are a few global tips for creating three-dimensional characters. Give them some uncharacteristic behaviour that surprises from time to time, either from a rebellious nature or some grave event that changes the way they do behave. Give your main characters great beliefs and great dreams, and let these dreams and beliefs be challenged in the story by events or antagonists. Add conflicting emotions within the character, also conflicting beliefs or personality traits. This gives added realism because it's exactly what you find in real people. As well as showing how talented your hero or heroine is, show their imperfections, and also how do they get over these imperfections and still excel at what they're trying to do. Most people have likes and dislikes. For your main character, give them intense likes and intense dislikes. Make everything bigger and grander and more intense. Of course, they should have good and bad habits like all of us. It's a great help to make the character more rounded if you give them a big and a dark secret that no one knows but themselves and maybe one other person. In the process of creating your character profile, think of as many questions as you can about your character. Go into great detail and write them all down. You should have a list of something like 50 to 60 questions. Cover every aspect of a real person's life, their emotional landscape, what they do for a living, are they religious, do they have friends, do they have many friends or just 2 or 3 special friends, etc. This is a copy of a part of a list that I created, and it's a way that I get all the detail together so that later on I can describe what this man or woman is really like. To expand the analysis and make sense out of the answers to the questions, write 300 to 500 words about your character. Try to cover his childhood up to the present time, but you can use as many words as you wish. The reason for the process is for you to get to know the character. As the author, you're going to try and persuade the reader that your character is real, believable, and you're going to make them care for the character. Once you have a description of your character,
you can imagine how he would behave in different situations. For example, when he's angry, when he's threatened, when he's accused or maybe hurt. How will he behave? What will he or she do? This is what I mean. A man or woman is eating in a restaurant, the door bursts open, and a man runs in with a mask and a big knife. What does your character do? How does he or she behave based on the details of your character analysis?
In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the character arc and also the story arc. Before we look at the detail, let me just say that the character arc focuses on the emotions and the internal landscape of the main character or the three-dimensional characters, while the story arc is more about what actually happens. We're going to look at how the two arcs interact and how one really is not possible without the other.
The character arc is the name given to the inner journey or the transformation of one of your major characters or the major character as he passes through the story. Normally, this is a change for the better, but it's not always like that. In fact, within this character arc, there could be a change for the better and back to the worse, or vice versa. These changes are brought about by events or the actions of others. So an arc for the character can't really be separated from the plot. The plot of a good novel that grips the reader is determined by the story arc. This is a simple formula used to structure and outline the plot of a novel. In its simplest form, it has just 5 parts. The exposition, or stasis, which is the beginning. Rising action. The climax, where everything comes to a head and the hero overcomes the greatest challenge. The falling action, leading down to the resolution, where everything is resolved and all the problems are sorted out. The story arc is often represented by this diagram. Sometimes it's an arc, but more often it's in the form of a triangle or a mountain. You can see that at the start, at the beginning on the left-hand side, we have the exposition or stasis. And later on we'll define these terms and explain exactly what they mean. The rising action is shown by the slope towards the climax. After the climax, where everything changes, we have the falling action, which leads down to the resolution. It's a useful way of planning a novel and a story so that the plot unfolds in the right way to create tension to engage the reader. In this slightly modified story arc, we have the same pyramid structure. On the left-hand side, we have the opening, which is another word for stasis or exposition. In the middle part of the novel, where the conflict is revealed, we see the rising action leading towards the climax. And then the falling action leads down to the ending or resolution. An interesting addition to this diagram is the fact that the ending on the right-hand side, the distance between the base and the ending, represents the character growth. This character growth has occurred through the character arc.
So very early on in our study of a story arc, we can see that what happens to the character is absolutely crucial. Because of the things that happen to the character, he changes. He changes internally. He either gains skills or he gains courage. Something happens based on his choices to make him change inside. The rising action part of the story arc is where many of the changes happened. This is where he overcomes obstacles and challenges and other things created by events, but also by other people in the story, either three-dimensional characters or support characters. It's a time of challenge and change.
It's important to note here that the two arcs, the arc of the story and the character, really can't be separated. Our three-dimensional characters affect and are affected by the twists and turns of the story. Now, the story can be character-driven or plot-driven. In a character-driven story, it's the character which acts and causes the events. In a plot-driven story, things happen around the character, causing him to constantly react. The rising and falling actions, and especially the climax, centre around the hero's actions and choices. The character arc represents how he changes as he makes these choices. At the beginning of the story arc, we have the exposition. This is where the author lays the groundwork for the plot to unfold. It's the starting point of the story and everything that it contains. This is where the author introduces the characters, sets the scene, explains where they are, and describes what's happening at the very beginning to give a basis for the story. The rising action is where the tension mounts towards the climax, and it generally has four elements. The trigger is the event that sets the whole story in motion. The quest explains how the character responds to this trigger, this event. The surprise is a twist in the plot or unexpected event. These are essential to craft a great novel. The critical choice is when the main character makes a decision leading to the climax of the story, when the hero or the heroine overcomes the greatest obstacle and challenge. After the trigger event, the story moves on in response, and this is called the rising action. This phase of the plot produces increasing tension, leading to the climax of the story. Throughout this phase of rising action, there are challenges and conflicts and problems arising, big and small, which have to be overcome by the main character. He or she changes in order to overcome these obstacles. This is called the character arc. The climax of the story arc is the tipping point of the main plot of the story. At this point, the tensions are at their highest. These tensions are caused by the character's actions and struggles against the obstacles put before him, often by the antagonist. It's when the most exciting action occurs. At this point, your readers should be highly engaged, wanting to turn the page to find out what happens to their hero or heroine. The falling action is the other side of the pyramid. The peak in tension is over, people can relax, and everything moves back to normal. But sometimes it doesn't move right back to normal because the hero or heroine have changed significantly. The resolution is the end of the book. The main plot and any subplots within it all come to an end. This is where all loose ends are tied up, unanswered questions are answered, and problems are solved. In many books, unless it's one in a series, it's where everyone lives happily ever after. We've explained the story arc in some detail, and the character arc, because the two arcs cannot be separated. It's the blending of the two that makes a fantastic novel. However, most novels are a bit more complex than described in our basic story arc, but the basic form applies, and it's very useful for structuring your story. A more realistic story arc could look like this. We still have the same basic form: the introduction, or the exposition, rising action leading to the climax, and falling action leading to the resolution. But you can see on the way from the introduction to the climax, the rise in action doesn't have one smooth rise to the peak. It has several smaller peaks. These peaks indicate some kind of conflict or challenge that the hero or heroine has to meet and overcome while on his way to the climax of the whole story. This is the way in which the author builds tension, and also the way in which the character changes internally.
So the story arc in its basic form gives us some idea of the basic structure of a novel or a story. But in the last diagram we saw that it's not simply a case of moving from exposition, or the beginning, up to a climax. There are many other mini-climaxes on the way. So now you have some idea of how the character arc and the story arc fit together, and how important the main characters are to your novel. In fact, if your main characters are not well crafted, described, and have fully developed characters, your novel will fail, because the reader will not identify with them and will not care what happens to them. Normally we have a main character who is a protagonist, someone trying to succeed or beat the opposition, and an antagonist, a person or a group that is trying to stop him or her. But there are other terms and other kinds of characters that we see in novels. In this video I'm going to take a look at the different types of main characters and also minor characters and what are their characteristics. And finally, a look at a special case, the foil, a character that often becomes attached to a protagonist or an antagonist.
The first type of character that you absolutely need is, of course, the protagonist. This man or woman is the main focus of the story. The whole plot revolves about what they're going to do, what they want to do, their desires, their secret fears, and their struggles against obstacles. To get some insight into this character, the reader needs to know quite a lot about them, either directly or implied. This is the character arc discussed in the last lecture. On the other hand, an antagonist is a person, maybe more than one person, or a group or an organization such as a government, that is set against the protagonist. The antagonist puts obstacles in the way of the protagonist so that he cannot achieve his aim. The aim of our novel is to show how the protagonist continuously overcomes these obstacles, which become more and more difficult and dangerous as the story progresses. Now, the antagonist may not always be downright evil. Maybe he's not too intelligent or a little misguided. He might be just ignorant of all the facts and confused. Because the antagonist is also a complex character, he can also change internally. A flat or static character doesn't change throughout the story. They don't learn lessons, they don't become aware, they don't have insights into their condition. They are one-dimensional characters with no capacity for internal growth. They have no emotional depth because the author has not rounded out the character. Round characters are major players. These are the protagonist and the antagonists. The protagonist's round characters experience internal growth by beating the challenges placed in front of them. They have fully developed and detailed personalities. The author develops the personalities by using the analysis and the character profiles that we discussed in the last lecture. These characters are lifelike and realistic. We can believe them. They have conflicting emotions and complex personality traits. Protagonists are rounded characters. A dynamic character is one that undergoes significant changes during the story, changing their belief structure, insights, or their understanding. Things change internally. A protagonist is a dynamic character. They can learn important lessons and change their outlook on life completely. The foil is often presented as an acquaintance or a colleague or a friend of the protagonist. He may not be too friendly. He's on the same side, but he's different, either physically, by their attitude, or other traits such as intelligence. They represent a contrast to the main character, helping to reinforce his place in the plot. Think of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Sherlock Holmes is thin and tall. Dr. Watson is shorter and fat. Sherlock Holmes is intellectual. He's very sharp and intuitive. Dr. Watson, although intelligent, after all he's a doctor, he doesn't have the same level of wit or insight. So he's often asking Sherlock Holmes about a case and how he deduced a certain result. The idea of the foil in fiction is very common and very effective. Often we have a pair of heroes or heroines, but usually it's one of the pair that is the real protagonist, and the other is simply there as the foil to help him move along the plot.
The process of making our characters come alive is called characterization. We can characterize in several ways. Some are more subtle than others. The first method is to be direct and simply tell people what a character is like. But of course that sometimes becomes difficult if we're talking about his internal workings, how he thinks, what motivates him, what is he like deep down. Let's look at some of the ways in which an author can characterize.
The way that an author presents the details about a character is very important for the reader. The whole success of a novel or story hinges around this. There are two ways we can characterize, either directly or indirectly. Look at these two sentences. Harry was a stingy man and had no compassion for those less well off. So we're telling the reader exactly what Harry was like. Indirectly, we could say, Harry pushed past the beggar's held-out hand without a second glance. Immediately the reader can see that he's not a very nice man. He doesn't really care about the less well off. This falls in line with one of the oldest tips in fiction, which is show, don't tell. It allows the reader to become immersed in your world without being told something by the narrator. The narrator can show something, but really the narration should be just in the background and not really the main focus of the book. Characterization includes the way the character looks, speaks, acts, and thinks. Often, all four relate to the others in intricate ways. Characterization involving these four elements is vital to making your novel alive. Vibrant characters are the main ingredient to your novel, and will entice the reader to follow your story to the end. One of the great secrets to characterization is in the detail. Provide enough detail that make your characters unique and particular. Don't just write a cliché of an existing character that you know of, or you've read about, or you've seen in a film. Strive for this uniqueness so that the character sticks out in the mind of your reader and the reader will remember. The reader uses the details to create an image of the character in their mind. They feel as though they know them. A well-crafted character becomes real. So the first way of characterization is to tell the reader directly what the person is like. Here's another example. He was a cruel man, a trait made worse by unusual physical strength. So it's pretty clear, and the reader knows that this man uses his strength and his cruelty to overcome and abuse others. We could describe a character's appearance and his manner to tell a reader what a man or woman is like. In this sentence, his policeman's uniform did nothing to improve his sallow complexion, a fact he was completely oblivious to. He walked around as though he was a real ladies' man. So the reader can imagine that this man is fooling himself. He's a little arrogant, probably not very self-assured. He thinks his uniform is helping to make him into a different person. He's quite vain and he's a little foolish. Inner dialogue is what the character thinks. We can use this to show a character's thoughts and motivations to give us some insight into the character's personality. This man is thinking, "How could I have thought that she would go out with me? She is as far above me as the moon is above the earth." It doesn't take a lot of imagination to feel that this character has quite a humble background, and he may be a little ashamed of it. He doesn't think he's worthy. He thinks the woman is too beautiful, or he's not too handsome. A whole range of ideas come to mind. We can use the character's dialogue to show the inner workings. "Can't you stop tapping your fork on the table? It seems you always manage to find a way to annoy me." It may be that this character is always grumpy and is just using this instance to express it. Or he may be talking to a child, one of his children. Or he may constantly victimize the other person in various ways. An author can use a character's actions to display a personality trait. James taunted the man mercilessly, pushing him over each time he tried to regain his feet. It's immediately apparent that James is not a nice man. He's cruel, he's got no compassion for the other, he doesn't like weakness, he has to push him again and again. In the reader's mind, this also sets the scene. What is James going to do in the future of this story? We can use the behaviour of other people to denote character. How do people behave when he's there? In this sentence, the back of every clerk stiffened as McGregor strolled quietly through the office. The reader can imagine that McGregor is not a nice boss at all. His workers are afraid of him, he's quite a tyrant, and the fact that he's walking slowly and quietly through the office means that he's trying to catch someone either not working properly or not working at all.
Perhaps the most difficult thing for an author to do is to create a believable character. Particularly the characters that appear in your book who are the heroes and heroines and the main focus of your whole story. As we've seen in previous lectures, these characters are very complex. They have personalities and they change throughout the novel. The first part in introducing a character is to describe them, but just a basic physical description is very unsatisfying, and so we use different ways to describe and introduce our characters. And there are other questions as well. Exactly when do we introduce our characters? Do we tell the reader everything at the beginning, or do we slowly deliver the information over a couple of chapters or even longer? In this lecture, we're going to look at the various ways of describing a character to make them believable and also interesting and memorable so that the reader can visualize them.
Remember that the character doesn't exist until the author describes them. It's an obvious fact, but it's worth noting. The reader knows just what you tell them, unless you tell them things that allow them to use their imagination to create the character themselves. We have to breathe life into them by describing them in various ways. Of course, the first level is just to describe them physically and directly. But this can turn a little flat unless you make it more vivid using other words, adjectives, and inventive phrases. It's clearly not enough to describe someone physically with flat nouns. A man is tall and fat and wears a brown suit. It doesn't really give a reader enough to go on to create a memorable character. Inevitably, we can use adjectives with the noun to try and make it more vivid, to allow the reader to visualize the character. But even this leads us into a dangerous area. We could say a man is incredibly fat, but it uses an adjective in a way that good prose tells us is not the right thing to do. We find ourselves writing clichés. For example, a man is as fat as a barrel. The use of well-known phrases is frowned upon in good prose because the reader comes to our novel, our story, to read something new, not to reread clichés and well-known phrases. So descriptive adjectives should be used very sparingly, and they should be unusual or fresh or used in unusual ways. A novel way to describe a character is to describe the objects around him instead. What kind of objects does the character use or prefer? What kind of objects are in their house or where they live? Do they have objects of art, or are they just purely for utilitarian reasons, practical and useful? What colour are most of the objects? Preferred objects can show the likes and dislikes in either design, colour, or the way they are used. This is a great help to describe character because it allows the reader to exercise their imagination. Empty the contents of an imaginary woman's handbag and describe what's inside it. Is it organised, or is it rather messy? Did she choose a handbag with pockets, or just one big bag and everything is just thrown in on top of each other? Is there a diary? Is there a book full of phone numbers? What kind of makeup is in there? Does she have trinkets or extra pieces of jewellery? You could put a man character in the situation of taking a flight. He can take one bag, just one piece of carry-on luggage. Because the size of a carry-on bag is limited, he can only take so many objects. What would your character choose and why? When we are focusing on physical details of a character, we can accentuate one aspect or a feature. This will help the reader to form images visually more easily. The readers really need to see a character, to feel that they are real, that they know them in some way, so they can identify with them and follow them through the story. For example, instead of writing, "His legs were thin and weak," we could write, "It hardly seemed possible that those legs could support him. They could simply snap at any moment." It's kind of humorous. It doesn't say that the legs were thin and weak, but it's pretty obvious. He may be a big, fat man, but the indication that his legs could snap tells the reader what he needs to know to create the image. Many authors describe the face first and use prominent features to indicate character. Often when we meet a person in real life, we look at their face first, and then in the next second or two we'll quickly scan down to their feet and back up again. We can use the prominent features to indicate a person's character. What features could describe a cruel face, or an arrogant man, an aristocrat, a prince, or a king, or a queen? Narrative can be used for some of the features instead of describing them directly, as it becomes more difficult as more features are described. Different people have different body types, and body types and the way that they move tend to be attached to certain kinds of personalities. Different people move their bodies in different ways. How does a shy person stand? A shy person doesn't want to stand out. He'll tend to stand behind things or in the shadow of something, or try and make himself appear a little small. A very tall person may stoop a little bit, bend his head down, and his shoulders may be rounded, because he's a bit self-conscious being so tall. A nervous type will not stand still. He'll look around, he'll move from foot to foot. We could describe the way a person eats and the kind of restaurant that he likes to eat in. This can indicate his class, how much money he has, and other character traits, like does he eat messily? Does she eat very slowly and very daintily, taking small bites? The way we walk is another indication of our character. Every one of us walks a little differently, and not only this, some days we walk differently from the previous one because of our mood or because of something that's happened that's unsettled us or made us very happy. We can either drag our feet along or we can walk on air. The secret of a good description is not just to describe a physical feature. That feature should be attached to an element of the character's personality in such a way that it sticks in the mind of the reader. In this way, that feature and the attached personality trait will be remembered because it will be interesting. So the description should say something about a character's personality. He held his head high, with an expression of slight disgust, as though there was a bad smell in the room. This person may be upper class, rich, or aristocratic, but without a doubt he feels himself superior. Finally, don't be in a hurry to describe your character. It really isn't necessary to describe a character right from the beginning. Reveal character traits slowly over several scenes and many pages using the various means that we described. When we meet a person in real life, we don't understand or know him very quickly. It develops over time, and it should be the same in your story. Other ways that you can show your character include other people's dialogue, or with other people's actions, other people's reactions. For example, a man walks into a store and several women turn to look. Immediately we know that this man is very attractive. Another technique often used, and somewhat cliched, is to use the idea of a character looking at themselves in a mirror, either admiring one part of their feature or trying to change one part of it, never really being happy with the way they look.
One thing a new author may not think about when starting to write his or her story is how to introduce characters. We spend quite a lot of time analysing a character, creating a profile, and trying to make our main characters real, three-dimensional, with depth, so that they are real for the readers. But how do we introduce them? We can't simply list them as the novel progresses. In this lecture, we take a look at various techniques authors use to introduce their characters.
At some point in our novel, we need to introduce our main characters. Of course, we can use their physical description in a direct manner, but these descriptions must be vivid and very dynamic if they're to be effective. Remember that our physical description of a character should also link to a feature of their personality. In this way, the reader will form a visual image and remember them and identify with them more easily. We can use movement and actions too. When people are moving, they reveal parts of their personality and character at the same time. It makes them easier to remember. Take this sentence. Mike was deadbeat. He flung himself onto the dirty mattress, for once not caring about his expensive suit. We learn several things from this introductory sentence. First of all, Mike was very tired. He needed to sleep, and so he just threw himself onto a dirty mattress. He was so tired he didn't care about the expensive suit he was wearing. We have a question in our mind. Why would he be sleeping on a dirty mattress? Maybe he's not home, he's somewhere else. Maybe he's a prisoner. We just don't know. So the reader's imagination starts to work, and later on other details will fill in the picture. He likes to wear expensive clothes, and he generally looks after them. In a previous lecture, we talked about the point of view, the POV. In a previous lecture, we described how common it was to write in the third person. But you could write in the first person, that is, the narrator could take the role of the main character. In that case, you wouldn't write he or she walked down the stairs. You would say I walked down the stairs. Writing in the first person, the character could describe himself directly, by an action he's performing or by expressing an emotion. If you do this, the narrator's speech, which of course is the main character, should be natural and follow the way that he speaks throughout the novel. The speech should be natural, and the action he's performing and describing himself should reveal an important part of their personality. Before your main character is actually presented to a reader, he can be introduced and described by others. This can be done in such a way that his appearance or his personality is revealed in some way. As in this sentence, she's always late, and she'll walk in with that "oh, is that the time" look, as if she didn't have a care in the world. Fine clothes don't make a lady, and hers are the finest, if you know what I mean. Now this sentence tells us that whoever's speaking doesn't have a very high opinion of the woman that they're waiting for. Maybe there are 2 or 3 people around a dinner table in a restaurant, and are used to be kept waiting by this person. As well as saying that fine clothes don't make you a better person, she indicates that this lady's clothes are very fine, indicating that she really is not a superior person. Backstory is the name of the history that the character has before she is introduced in the novel. It can indicate what they look like physically, their appearance, their social status, or the relationship status. In this sentence, John rubbed his left shoulder, ruefully remembering the wrestling opponent that dislocated it so many years ago. We get the idea that John has an old injury that bothers him from time to time. He was obviously a wrestler in the past, and we don't know if he was an amateur wrestler or a professional wrestler. But it was a long time ago, many years ago, so we have some pieces of information here that we can start to use to imagine John. He used to be a very fit man, probably muscular. The dislocation happened many years ago, so John is no longer young. In this way, when John is introduced in reality later on in the novel, we already have these things in mind, and it helps us to create the character. When introducing characters, remember that static descriptions can be really boring unless you describe someone really well in a vivid manner with interesting words. It's a good idea always to include action. When someone is doing something, performing a task, or interacting with other people, it's much more interesting than if they're standing there being described. In whatever way you choose to introduce a character, and this should vary for different characters, don't stop the flow of the action. It's not advisable to interrupt the plot to describe a character. Characters should be introduced when the plot needs it, and their presence adds something to the story.